Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to give a very brief guide to analyzing Hebrew poetry, in particular, the distinguishing characteristic of Hebrew poetry, which is parallelism, which in essence is the relationship between lines. So, in any verse of Hebrew poetry, and most English translations are going to actually lay the poetry out in lines. Typically, you'll have two lines, but occasionally you'll have three. And the chief important question to be asking is in poetry, unlike if you think of an English song lyric, the lines tend to rhyme. Hebrew poetry doesn't use rhyme scheme. Instead, what Hebrew poetry does is it uses the feature of parallelism. So as a listener to a Hebrew poem, the way that an author surprises or satisfies the ears of the audience is by the way that the poet says one line and then follows it up with a second line that has some relationship to the first line. So what that means is that Hebrew poetry has repetitive features. The key question that we want to ask ourselves is how does line 2 or line 3, if there's multiple ones, relate to line 1? So that's essentially the question that we're asking ourselves. And this goes back to an important work by James Kugel, The Idea of Biblical Poetry, who critiqued previous ways of laying out Hebrew poetry and argued that the key thing is essentially this is true, so also is this. So, and again, what's the relationship between the initial line of poetry and then the following lines? How do they restate, nuance, expand, or repeat the first line? Now, the traditional system, and this works to some extent, so I want you to be aware of this, analyzed poetry essentially in terms of three groups. Synonymous lines of poetry in which line 1 or line A is then essentially repeated, sometimes even down to the word order, by the second line. The opposite of that would be antithetical, in which line A says one statement and then line B reverses that in some way and almost stands in contrast to what we see in line A. Now, synthetic is when it's not when the relationship isn't obviously purely repetitive or synonymous or contrasting or antithetical, and then you get some different nuances. Now, if you've studied inductive Bible study structures, this can help us in a way, because in a sense, sometimes the relationship between line A and line B might be a cause and then the effect. Line A could be very general, and then line B can be more specific, which would be a movement from general to particular. So our IBS structures can be used to actually describe that. So again, when we're doing poetic analysis, go ahead and use synonymous or antithetical. If you're going to say synthetic, try to say more. How do you see the second line relating back to the first line? And that will help you to describe poetry, and it also is going to help your work, that it helps you to appreciate what the poet's doing. Now, if you need a couple of additional resources, obviously Kugel's book is a classic. The book by Watson, Classical Hebrew Poetry, is another full book treatment, full monograph on this if you're really interested in a deep dive into all the features of Hebrew poetry. And also commentaries, the ones that we're using for this class. James Mays' Psalms commentary has just a page and a half discussion, and our New International Commentary in the Old Testament, the Book of the Psalms, has from 39 to 42 some further discussion on it to clarify it. Now, but speaking in theory, let me show you a couple of examples now. I have two examples from Psalm 2, and then I have one example from a proverb that can illustrate these relationships. So Psalm 2:1. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? Okay, so what's the relationship there? Is it not true that essentially line B is repeating line A or saying it in a similar way. This would be what's known as synonymous, right? You can see it. Why do the nations conspire? Peoples plot in vain. So nations, peoples, conspire, plot. This is kind of a classic example of synthetic. Look at example 2. This comes from the Proverbs, and this is a very common structure for a proverb. A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son grief to his mother. So we have a contrast, right, between the wise and the foolish. And notice also we have brings joy, brings grief, father, mother. So this would be an example of antithetical parallelism, right? It's clear that line A is then the opposite is given in line B. Now, again, these two, synonymous, antithetical, are the easiest to spot. But a lot of poetry, as you'll learn as we move through various psalms, have more complex relationships between the lines. And let me start with just a two-line one. Psalm 2:6. I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. All right, what's going on here? Again, two poetic lines. Line A, I have installed my king. Line B, on Zion, my holy hill. Now, clearly, these are related, right? Because they're talking about installing, and essentially this makes the statement I've installed, and what's the line B do? It's giving the location, right? So what's the relationship? What's the relationship? So this would be an example of what traditionally would have been called synthetic, but we want to be more specific. So obviously it's going to describe where, but is it not true that this is more of a general statement? I've installed my king, and then this is giving particular information. So we might call this the movement from general to particular. So when you're analyzing the parallel lines, that's what you want to do. If it's obviously repeating the same idea, that's synonymous. If it's giving the opposite, you can just write antithetical. But then when it's a little bit more complex, I would add some extra words describing how you see the relationship between the two lines. That's going to greatly enhance your ability to appreciate Hebrew poetry, understand it, and ultimately interpret it. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. I'm Brian Russell, and it's my privilege to serve as your instructor this term.